Video Publishing's YouTube channel. So today we're going to be focusing on the manuscript. We're going to be focusing on completing a manuscript and getting it ready for layout and design. Basically getting it to the point where anyone will be able to read the book because it is now complete. Now in this video, we're going to be focusing on non-fiction books because with Video Publishing, most of what I will share is actually implemented the most on non-fiction books. So non-fiction books such as memoirs, your biographies, your autobiographies, the same services are provided for the different genres that we help to self-publish. But what I will cover is done in more depth on non-fiction books. We'll be focusing on 5 things, right? The first one is ghostwriting. Then we'll focus on substantive editing, then developmental editing, copy editing, and finally proofreading. Now with the terminology, it can be quite confusing because some people use some of these words interchangeably. So for instance, substantive editing can sometimes be used interchangeably with developmental editing, but I saw that there actually is a difference. So I will make the clear distinction between the two so that we are all on the same page and understand. And then with copy editing as well, sometimes it can be termed line editing, but I will keep it at copy editing so that we all understand. Alright, let's start with ghostwriting. Now with ghostwriting, essentially it would be when there is no manuscript, right? I'll give you an example. So let's say there's someone who wants to write an autobiography of themselves, or they want to write a biography. Now they don't have a manuscript, they don't have anything written on paper, they don't have anything typed out, and they need assistance. In that case, there would be a matter of us needing to gather information, and maybe in the form of interviews. So in the case of an autobiography, we may need to interview the author or the person that wants to write a book about themselves. In the case of a biography, it may be that we need to interview people who are in connection with the person for whom or about whom the book is being written. Now, before we do the interviews, it's very important for us to actually plan. So we plan based on the scope. It's very important for us to determine the actual scope of the manuscript. So what is that we're going to cover? What information would a potential reader want to know? What information would be relevant? And in that case, that's where we would then jot down all the necessary questions for us to be able to interview the different people. Now, when we are doing the actual interviews, yes, we would have pen and paper to jot down all the answers, but it's also very important for us to actually have a recorder, because how likely is it that we'll be able to jot down everything that is being said, right? It's highly likely that there may be things that we might miss out, and therefore it's very important for us to have a recorder so that we have information both on paper and on the recorder. The beautiful thing about having a recorder as well is that we get to record the exact words of the author, or let's say the person that wants to write an autobiography, because that is actually going to help tremendously when it comes to us making sure that the voice of the author is actually heard in the book. It's actually part of a style of writing, because essentially people who will read that autobiography need to hear the voice of the author. And if it's someone that is well known, people will be able to truly pick up that, okay, this is actually this person speaking here and not someone else who wrote the book for them. After the relevant people have been interviewed, we now have the full information that we can now use. Now it is at this point that we begin to write the manuscript from the very beginning using the information that we have gathered. Once that is done, we then move into the stage which is substantive editing. Now with substantive editing, we look into the overall manuscript. So we look into the scope. Have we covered everything that needs to be covered on the manuscript? We look at the length, if the length of the manuscript is appropriate. We look at the structure, if there is a logical flow in the structure of the manuscript itself, if there's a logical flow of the content from one paragraph to the next. It looks at whether there is a clear meaning and a purpose for each and every single word that is on that manuscript. It also looks at aspects of plagiarism and legal issues. but at least with biographies, it will essentially be information that is being gathered, and there will not necessarily be any copyright issues. The copyrights will remain with the author. There would, however, be a contract signed to make sure that the person gathering the information agrees that they are only gathering the information for the purposes of the book project, and that they understand the legal action that will be taken against them should they do otherwise. The next stage is developmental editing. Now, with developmental editing, it looks into the detail that is on the manuscript, the detail of the content. This is the detail that would essentially draw the reader's attention. So it looks into things like if there's any inconsistencies in the storyline. It looks into the gradual transformation of the characters as the story develops and changes over time. It looks at the pacing, it looks at the dialogue. So with developmental editing, it truly requires a developmental editor who has experience in the genre. Essentially, developmental editing is what adds the extra spice. It adds some more sauce into the manuscript, because with substantive editing, it's just a matter of determining the scope. It just looks at the overall overview of the whole book to see if you've covered everything from beginning to end, looking at the scope, looking at the length, looking at the logical flow, looking at the structure. But with developmental editing, that's where we get to make the book. To make the book. It's what makes the book appealing. It makes the book fun and interesting. Now, the next stage would then be the copy editing stage. Copy editing looks at each and every single line. It looks into 6 things. The first thing is the structure. And what I mean by structure is the structure of the sentences. So with the English language, there is something called a subject and a predicate, because each sentence would then essentially have a subject and a predicate. There are things such as simple sentences, compound sentences, complex sentences, compound complex sentences, and that's just a matter of creative writing. Structure also looks at the completeness of sentences. There's a whole range of things that need to be looked into when it comes to structure, but that is just the basics or some of the things that I covered. The second thing that copy editing looks into is the style. So the style referring to the style of writing, how you're composing your sentences, how you use your words, or the choice of your words. The third thing that copy editing looks into is accuracy, and that essentially is looking into the spelling, making sure that the spelling is accurate, making sure that the punctuation is also accurate, because with punctuation there are different punctuation marks, but each punctuation mark has its purpose, and therefore it needs to be used in an accurate way. So essentially that would be your full stops, your commas, your semicolons, your dashes, your question marks, exclamation marks, all a matter of you knowing how to accurately use them. The fourth thing that copy editing looks into is meaning. So that essentially looks into making sure that the words that you are used in such a way that the meaning of them is clear, that they are used correctly in the correct context. It looks into the grammatical principles. So whatever word that you are going to be using in whatever context it is, we must make sure that the context in which the word is used is actually correct. So essentially we must make sure that the words or the text that is used in the correct context, and that the meaning of the word is then clear and understandable. The fifth thing that copy editing looks into is consistency. Now we have 2 things that are implemented for consistency. One is called a style sheet, and another one is called a house style guide. So a style sheet is basically a document that looks into consistency that will be implemented for that particular book. So I'll give an example. We may have a rule that for that particular book, let's say it's talking about the earth or planet, or this reference of the world or the earth. Now instead of using the word planet, we then choose to use earth, because sometimes you can use planet or you can use earth. So we'd maybe choose to use the word earth, and then have that word earth being referred to throughout the whole manuscript, and not interchangeably now say earth and planet, but rather use the word earth throughout the whole manuscript. The other thing we look into, the second thing, is the house style guide, and that is basically rules that we use for consistency for all books. So I'll give an example. We can have a rule that we're going to use British English and not US English for all the books that we have to self-publish. There is a difference. The difference is in spelling. Date format is also another thing that we can decide on in terms of consistency. So we choose that we'll say 31 March 2022 and not 31st of March 2022 every time we refer to a date. So we need to keep the formatting of the dates consistently throughout for all books. It's a whole list of rules, but the whole point of it is to make sure there's consistency for that particular book and for all books that are published through that particular company, in this case through us. And then the sixth and the last thing that copy editing looks into is the clarity, basically making sure that the sentences have logic, that everything is logical, is comprehensible, it's coherent. And then the last thing that we look into, the fifth thing that we look into, is then proofreading. Now with proofreading, there isn't much that is required because by then all the main things or the main tasks would have been covered in much depth. Proofreading is just a matter of seeing if there's any errors. If the editor who did copy editing or substantive editing or developmental editing did not do a good job, the proofreader would essentially be able to pick it up. And that is why we have these different stages, to make sure that each and every single stage gets its own attention, so that by the time we get to the proofreading stage, everything that needed to be done by that point is actually done thoroughly. And that is it from me. I hope that was quite insightful. And if you did like the video, do please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't as yet, and click on the notification bell for new videos that do come up. Thank you so much for your time, and I shall see you on the next video. Bye now.